Welcome to another weekend here on the platform. My name is Sam Omatseye. Now tell us about your fascination with Hubert Ogunde.
Hubert Ogunde. What's the fascination there? How did it begin? Eliani, I said, produced a play of his at a school I was at then called Ideal Girls School. And I was an angel. And I still remember some of these songs. And it stood me.
Can you sing one of them?
No, I won't, because my Yoruba is terrible. I could sing it in English because nobody understood it. Whatever I like. I just got the tune right, you know. And so I knew him more than I knew Ogunde, naturally. I got to know about Ogunde later, much later. And so the Ogunde factor came in during my, for my research, for my MPhil at Leeds.
Yeah.
I originally offered to study kinetics as a language of gestures.
Body movement.
Language of body movement. And they didn't have anybody there to supervise me. He said, suggest another topic. So I said, Ogunde. He said, wow, yeah.
That's how I started.
That's how I started. And but of course I remember his seeing posters in the 40s, because I was at school in Lagos for about 3 years. So
and you had this very fascinating long interview with him eventually.
Well, I would say I stayed with him for about 70. It was very interesting actually, because when Leeds accepted my topic, I phoned him. It's very difficult to get people, especially if they're important.
Yes.
They won't answer you straight.
Yeah.
Ogunde answered me straight. So I introduced myself, and he arranged, an appointment straight away, a meeting. And I went to Noble Street, where he was in Yaba. With his family. And he started to talk, and we talked. And and then I said, where did you used to perform? He gave me the list, and then he got to Ife. And he said he performed in this school in Ife. I said, that's my grandfather. So he went on and on and on. Then he turned around and said, what? I said, you performed in my grandfather's school in Ife. You're Nigerian? I said, yes. Your grandfather is Yoruba? I said, yes. Who are you? So I mentioned my name, and he got up yelling. He went to his daughter, said, come, everybody come. Everybody rushed him, think something terrible had happened, He said, this is an Ijebu woman. I said, what? She's only 4 miles from Ososa. That's how I got to know him. It's as simple as that. But then I stayed. I was very much with the family all the time. I used to sit on the stage whenever he performed at Glover Hall. I'll be there with my tape recorder and record the whole program.
What was it about Ogunde that people don't really know? One, about his personality, and two, about his dramaturgy.
There's a separation.
Yes.
There is, because as of today, there's really no study on Ogunde himself. Just Ogunde theater.
Theater, yes.
My study is on the theater. It's not Ogunde, the person. And Ogunde's family. I may mention it within the theater because the family and the theater were one in a way, but not all his wives were in the theater.
Yes, I know.
That's the interesting point. Not all his wives were in the theater. He had wives who were not in the theater. Very few, but they were there. And so I wouldn't know because I kept out of his personal life. Completely. Only mentioned in as far as it related to the theater.
What of his dramaturgy?
Not around anymore. When he was there, people thought most of the time it was a concert theater. My studies show that definitely it was not. It was a textual theater to begin with.
Please explain. What does that mean?
Textual means that he wrote down the opera. He wrote down the libretto, the words of the opera that must be sung.
Yeah.
All right. and the pamphlets were sold during performance. All right, so some people still have it. He borrowed a whole book of it from a friend of his and gave it to me to look at. I've since returned the book. And then he moved from that, from textual to the concert ones, which were mainly improvisation. I mentioned all of
yes, you did. Yeah.
And that's a long time ago, by the way. I stopped really studying Ogunde. I stopped doing research on Ogunde since 1982. I think that was the last time when I had this interview with him. That was the last.
Yeah.
Because he had moved to film, and I'm not in
film.
I'm not a scholar of cinematography. All right.
And you're talking about festival. The West did not think that we had theater.
Not at all.
And they thought we had festivals.
Yes.
They didn't understand.
And if you had theater, it was just to enjoy yourself and dance and sing. And because Africans are not that intelligent. Yeah. Not knowing that in this operatic phase, it was being used and weaponized by the nationalist movement.
It couldn't Zik.
Zik was his number one sponsor.
Yeah.
It was through West African Pilot and other papers I was able to have this volume of information on the weaponization, political weaponization of the theater, and how they chose him to do that, and how you would go to theater to enjoy yourself and you were being politicized, to ask for independence, to ask these people to go away, to reorient your mind from what was Western to more Nigerian, more African.
More authentic.
Well, I wouldn't know whether you call it authentic or not authentic. Because right now, I always say we are culturally hybrid.
Yeah, yes.
As long as you're colonized, you are going to imbibe yourself with the culture of your colonized.
Many people do not know, and they don't write about Ogunde as a nationalist. And well,
I almost didn't do that chapter, chapter 3, I think it was. The theater nationalist movement. I tried to get out of it. It was my supervisor who refused. So
you must do that. Yes.
Because I didn't see why I should expose what we did. But he got it out of me. And that, I think, is what really fascinated, especially foreign readers. They really did.
I think you're making a parallel between Ogunde and Shakespeare, and how both of them use or weaponize, to use your word, weaponize art or theater for governance.
They're not necessarily the one who would do it. It would be those who want it weaponized who will use it. Remember that Shakespeare was just a worker within the Lord Chamberlain's men theater. And he was a writer and actor. He also acted.
Yes.
And
they're all male.
All male. It was female impersonation theater, like the Ghanaian theater.
Yes.
Ghanaian theater too was female impersonation theater. And so was classical Yoruba theater.
Really?
Yes, classical theater was all male. Yeah. It was Ogunde, I said, with Lion Onimole and Ogumola, who and Uduro Ladipo, who brought in women.
Female, okay.
Yeah, but they didn't really turn as commercial. That was my interest. Ogunde led the commercial aspect of the theater. All right. I'm not saying the others were not around. Of course they were around, and I interviewed them. Lion one was very interesting. My Lion interview of Lion. He refused to see Mrs. Ibisomi, the late Ibisomi Ogunde, took me to his canteen or restaurant, in Oyinbo Market. And he refused to see us 3 times, Then, the 3rd time, we went. And I said, I have to interview him. I've got to interview him. So when he refused again, I stood in the middle. I'm not joking. I just stood in the middle of that restaurant and I started to sing his song that he had taught me at school in 1948. And it came out because he had not heard it. So he was amazed and we sat down. He said, "Where did you learn that song?" I gave him the name of the school. Who was the principal? I gave him the name of this principal. What was the name of her daughter? I said, I can't remember that name, but she was fat and fair. So he gave me the name. At least I said she was fat and fair.
So you had the description.
And he said, you still remember. By the way, your Yoruba is terrible. Don't sing my song again. That's how it came out.
Yeah.
And it was later on I said, my goodness, the ironical nature of that meeting, that in 1940-something, somebody taught me a song. And if that song had not been remembered by me, I wouldn't have got that interview. I got that interview because of the song. All right? So that was my connection with Lion there, you know, and of course he was very generous with this interview, and I still got the tape of that interview. I've got the tapes of Ogunde performances that I took anyway.
Oh, you took,
There was no television in those days, no camera, no camcorder. And so everything was just on this reel-to-reel tape, if you remember.
Yes,
you know,
yes, I agree.
I've got quite a bit. Some have been destroyed through flooding, but I got quite a bit.
Lucy Negro.
Lucy Negro.
Tell us what fascinated you with that fact. Lucy Negro, as you have suggested, was actually a black woman in England who was also Shakespeare's lover. Before
you can get to Lucy Negro,
yes,
you have to, in fact, even ask how were Africans even there? By the way, in England,
in 1601,
not in UK, and not in Great Britain.
In 1601,
because there was no such thing as UK then.
Yes,
or Great Britain. Okay. No, this was long before 1601. You know,
no, 1601 was when they asked them to leave. Yeah.
Well, supposedly. As African is there.
Africans,
you know, it's called the Negro Transportation Edict. Is there. But the edicts, different edicts came from 1593. Two in 1593, one in 1596, and the final one in 1601. People are more familiar with 1601, but I have given you information that there were others before the 1601. Lucy Negro, I wasn't really fascinated by her as such. I was invited by the head of Renaissance department in the Faculty of English, University of Cambridge, when I was there for 1 year as a visiting fellow at Corpus Christi College.
Yes.
And we met, the late Professor Ann Barton. I went to her rooms at Trinity College, and we talked about my research while I was at Corpus, to enlarge my paper on Othello, the Complete Gentleman, into a book.
Yes.
You know. And we started to talk about it. By the way, do you know there are 2 lines in Sir Thomas More, which was written by various Renaissance playwrights, but hand D, different hands. Hand D is supposed to be by Shakespeare. Written by Shakespeare. And if you look at 2 lines there, you may be fascinated to do your research on these 2 lines. So I said, really, I'm really here to do a book. So, well, if you're interested, why not conduct a postgraduate seminar on these 2 lines? I spent a whole year on these 2 lines.
What are those 2 lines?
The strangers going to the port with their babies on their backs.
Yes.
The poor strangers, yes, that word is very important. The poor strangers
going to the
port
with their babies on their backs.
That's all. It took me a whole academic session to do my research on these 2 lines. Of course, I read the whole book. The hands written by other writers.
Yes.
And I read all what scholars wrote about them. And of course, it took me to this edict. And I had read, of course, that famous book called Othello Countrymen by Professor Eldred Jones.
Edred Jones. Who
died last year.
Last year. Yes.
At the glorious age of 90-something.
Yes.
I had read his book before arriving anyway.
Yeah.
And so I used the various expulsion edicts, not just 1601, to marshal my arguments that the people being asked to go were blacks. So I said, right, when could this have been written? So I went into a lot of research and I found a lot of information, which I gave during my very prestigious postgraduate seminar to the postgraduate students in the Renaissance department, which was open to outsiders. And the famous Professor Muriel Bradbook came to this seminar of mine. And after I had finished ramping home, giving my final suggestions and said, yes, it's 1596, I think this thing was written. And everybody fired me with questions. Muriel just sat down there listening. And then she said, I don't think you know, Professor, that the Irish also carried their babies
on their backs. And the Irish were poor.
Not only that, they carried with a knife in their back. So I said, then it could be 1593. Mm-hmm. Then later on, I came back and said no, because Shakespeare wouldn't have used the poor.
Yeah.
Because the Irish were always being thrown out every month. If you look at the Harwood calendar, you will see expulsion of Irish as beggars and vagabonds almost every month. And Jesuit priests as papal spies almost every month. Shakespeare would not put poor because it was a regular
thing.
It must have been something specific for him to be sympathetic with. That was how I held my ground. And she nodded her head, yes.
This was a peculiar.
Yeah, yes, peculiar. Yeah. I agree with you, peculiar. But still consider that Irish point. So afterwards I said to Anne, I've got a double edge here. It could be Irish, because 1593 is possible. She said, Ebun, stick to your guns. Stick to your guns. Now, so I had all this information about the blacks on these two lines. My own suggestion, not Shakespeare's suggestion. He didn't mention it, that they were blacks. It was this carrying their babies
on their backs.
That struck my attention there, that garnered my attention there.
There was even the issue of there being showing remove, detachment from those people.
Yes, yes, there was. Not what we had during the colonial period.
What I meant, was that using the idea of their babies on their back rather than carrying babies on their backs. It shows a sort of detachment.
We have to look at complete works of Shakespeare. Let me look at those two lines to be specific. Go and look when you finish. Get complete works of Shakespeare. Look at the book of Sir Thomas More. And check hand D. It's not it's not a long one. You will see two lines. Whether it is poor, whether it is what, but I remember I think it is poor. It depends entirely on the edition you're reading as well. You know? You will see it. And about 3 years ago, the Globe Theatre did a reading of it. And I was, listening to it really moved me because, of course, they wouldn't know that I had done this kind of work on it before, you know. And so it's not something that is done a lot. It's seldom seen, this one of Andy. Now, so what happened with Lucy Negro? I was invited by the Students Association of English branch, University of Ibadan branch. I had retired by then. The president just came to my house and said, we would like you to deliver a lecture for us. So I said, I'm retired. He said, yes, but we know you still know. So I said, what do you want me to talk about? It's in honor of Professor Ayobanjo, by the way. Former Vice Chancellor, the guru in English language. So if you want to know anything about English language, go to Professor Ayobanjo. Just been
and Bangoshe too now has just been celebrated as 90.
95, wasn't it?
90.
90. Fantastic person. And so I then said, okay, let me look at this aspect of Shakespeare's relationship with an African woman. Muriel Bradbook, how did I know about Lucy anyway? I had read about her in a 19th century book, History of English book, that She was formerly the mistress of a friend of Shakespeare, who passed her on to Shakespeare. Matter of exchange.
Exchange, yes.
Passed her on. And Muriel, and I think I read it too in Eldred Jones' books, her name. That, what is it now? I've mentioned the name, Othello's Countryman.
Yes.
And then Muriel herself, a powerhouse in Renaissance literature, particularly Shakespeare, said to me, one of the visits to her place, to her house, said, Ebun, we agree that Lucy Negro existed. That those of us in that subject. We agree that she was an African, Negro.
Negro.
But what we will never agree to is that the love poems called the Dark Ladies were dedicated to her. That one we will not agree with at all. So I hadn't thought about Lucy Negro at that time. And I used to call her Mama. Anyway. So I would say, okay, Mama, you know, we were, I agree with you for now. She said, okay, Ebun, you can say anything you like about Lucy Negro. Do not say that the sonnets, the Dark Lady sonnets, were dedicated to her. And that is exactly what I said in my paper I delivered to the students and the gathering, that they were dedicated to her. Because when you read it as a Black woman, it resonates. You can see your own face in the description.
And it was, and the poems were very, very detailed. Yes,
I used myself because I used my experience. He mentioned wiry hair.
Yeah.
And when I arrived in England, my hair was totally natural. Up to the age of 18, I did not straighten it.
And people were touching your hair.
Touching my hair, banging on the hair, saying, oh, isn't it woolly? Isn't it springy? Oh, and in fact, somebody attempted to cut my hair off on the bus, you know, because she had never seen it. I said, my goodness. So he mentioned springy hair, and I could relate straight away, because that is what I was described to have when I was there. And he mentioned dung, D-U-N-G, which is a medieval word, an Elizabeth word for brown.
Brown.
So you have to look at all this. If you are from another culture and you're looking from the perspective of another race, you may not see it. The allusions to blackness,
yes.
in particular the most famous of all the sonnets. So I'm sorry, I said, yes, it is. Now, why Lucy Negro too to these students? I think I delivered it in 1990. Before I delivered it after my Shakespeare and Governance, which I delivered for the Nigerian Britain Association,
NBA.
In 1997, I was their lecturer there. And then this one, I knew that a lot of the students who are going to graduate will eventually migrate, will eventually go into diaspora. And I also wanted to alert them that all is not green over the fence. Be careful. Not that you will not be happy, you'll be happy, because they are generous. We're not as generous with strangers as I think Europeans are. I think we really do, we're not really very grateful. They're very generous, for now, you know. And I said, so I then put in the fact of this expulsion.
Of
You see, a theater historian, we use history as a means to an end, not as an end in itself. As a means to an end to cast more understanding on a particular text. We're not politicians, we're not historians as such in the true sense of the word, but you've got to deal with history as a matter of fact. You've got to be factual in your history. You cannot be creative with it. So I said, there's a possibility, because in Othello, the Complete Gentleman, I had mentioned another source, beside the source that is known, Cynthia. I said the possibility of the Negro expulsion was there, because like Ogunde theater, like Yoruba theater, governors used to use Renaissance traveling theater as their information bureau. That's why I'm saying there's a similarity. Have you got that?
I got it.
Elizabeth will come out with something, and the theater will pick it up to educate the audience about this new fact that has come out. There was a Gaspar van Zenden, a merchant from Luxembourg, all right, who had brought in 12 white prisoners. And Elizabeth asked her, how much do you want me to pay for this, my prisoners you have brought back? Which meant that they were enslaved. And he had released them and brought them back. And he said, pay me back with the number of blacks in your realm. And therefore she brought out the 1593. And then asking a slave trader to carry the few he had brought to England out. Within 3 weeks, she countermanded them and said, give those slaves to Gaspar to take away. And nobody did. That was how you got the 1601, after 298 white prisoners have been brought back by this man. It's very, very fascinating.
Very fascinating. People should read it. This is the book, On Stage, Shakespeare and Ogunde. One Stage, Shakespeare and Ogunde. It's a very fascinating book. We could go on and on with this interview, but we're out of time already. Thank you very much for being on the show. Very illuminating. And you turned 80 last year. And you were and 81 this year. And 81 this year. And you're still looking very strong. And we pray Almighty God continue to keep you with us.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for being on this show. You can join me on my column at www.samomatseye.com and on my Twitter at Sam Omatseye. And until next time, be good.